Can you hear me? Okay. Well, it's lovely to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me, especially Shalini. So I'm Dr. Tim Lomas. Okay. So I'm a psychology research scientist at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. And this talk is going to be on what I call the dynamics of flourishing, a new wave of global scholarship. Okay. Sorry, just bear with me. Okay, sorry about that. So this talk is going to be in roughly 3 parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about a brief history of WEIRD, Wellbeing Scholarship. Before I go on, does everyone know what that acronym WEIRD is referring to? Does anyone not know? Industrialized, rich, democratic. So this has been a very prominent, influential, and helpful acronym. It has its issues, as I'll come on to, but it captures the point that a lot of our research has tended to be conducted in places like the United States and Western Europe, which has influenced the findings and the nature of the scholarship in many ways, which is kind of what the kind of central line of this talk is. Then I'm going to talk about a new emerging wave of what we can call global or cross-cultural wellbeing scholarship, and finish off by presenting a map that my boss, Tyler Vanderweel, and I have constructed to try and account for this different research that we've been, that I'll try and summarize in this talk. So first of all, you're probably wondering, who's this weird English guy on stage? So just to briefly tell you a bit about me, who I am, why I'm here. I'll spare you my extensive biography, but the salient thing to mention maybe is that, you know, I'm from London. I grew up in London, but then had a very influential experience when I was 19, and I went to China to teach English for 6 months before starting university. We had a program at our college where you could take a gap year and go and teach. And as you can imagine, this experience was life-changing in so many ways, and I landed there. To be honest, I was very naive at that time. My friends would joke that I couldn't even find my way around London. I was like, I'm going to show you, I'm going to go to China, I'm going to try and make it there and see if I can manage. And it was so radically different in so many ways, which I'll comment about. I don't want to stretch that too far, because at the same time, I also recognize that people do share considerable similarities, well, common human nature. And I think that's important, just to go off on a slight tangent right at the start here, because when you do the kind of research we do, where you're looking at different cultures and different societies, sometimes you can find 2 contrasting tendencies. The first is what I might call a tendency towards universalism. That's to emphasize commonality, to say there's like a common human nature. People are pretty similar the world over. Then there's an opposing tendency, which you could call pluralism or relativism, which really focuses on difference. The thing is, they sound like opposites, but I think they're both true, and they both need to be borne in mind, because if you just think about what people have in common, you lose sight of the differences, which are meaningful and relevant and significant. But if you just focus on difference, you might lose sight of what brings people together, what we share in common. So something I try to do in my work is to keep both in mind, to bear in mind what we do share in common, but also to look at the differences, which can also be meaningful and significant. So I kind of realized that, you know, in dramatic ways, really, when I was in China. But just to briefly dwell upon some of the differences, you know, I spent some time traveling around, and I visited some Buddhist and Taoist monasteries. And then, in fact, the next summer I went back and spent some time in Tibet, and again, spent a lot of time in the monasteries there, and realized I was really, I guess, cognitively, intellectually, really out of my depth, you know, or rather, there was so much I was experiencing that was outside my cognitive and intellectual horizons, so much I didn't understand. Concepts I couldn't begin to grasp, even if they'd been translated, even if they were explained to me. I realized that this is not something I'm familiar with growing up in London. You know, particularly concepts relating to Buddhism and Taoism, but also just general aspects of life. So it's such an eye-opening experience in that respect. And particularly then, when I returned back to the UK and I studied psychology up in Edinburgh, and then I really quickly realized that, for example, in the Chinese context, Buddhism has such intricate, rich, detailed theories of the mind and of well-being and flourishing. And that was like nowhere in my textbooks. That didn't make it in there at all. I mean, there was fragments of research on mindfulness was beginning to creep in, which obviously comes from that region. But I realized that the research, the academia, the psychology that I was encountering was very partial, very Western. Most of the people most of the scholars you would read about were from the United States or from Europe. And I realized, having spent that time just in China, that there was so much, so many deep traditions of thought in relation to the mind and well-being in China and by extrapolation elsewhere that just wasn't in the curriculum I was studying. And that feeling really stayed with me. So it's something I've tried to bring in, that awareness has always guided me of the need to kind of look outside our context, outside our culture, and to try and engage with kind of insights and wisdom and scholarship from around the world. So that's kind of a unifying theme, in my work generally, and also in this talk. So in this first section, I'm going to give a brief history of this weird well-being scholarship. Okay, I'm going to use the metaphor of waves, the notion of fields evolving through different waves. So drawing out this metaphor further, you could say these waves are unfolding in a Western ocean current. This is important because there's obviously other oceans, as it were, metaphorically out there. And this new wave of global scholarship that we're going to talk about, is really this intermingling of oceans, which is very significant. But to go back to the point I was just making, a lot of the mainstream research on well-being and flourishing has been taking place in what you call this Western Ocean. And this draws on different currents, again, to kind of stretch this metaphor further. So going back to the classical era of Greek philosophy, so lots of concepts and ideas that are still drawn upon. So for example, this distinction between hedonia and eudaimonia. And if people are familiar with these terms, I'm guessing probably most are. So something gets traced back to people like Aristotle. You can make the point that there's hedonic forms of happiness, if you will. But then the Greeks would really valorize what they called eudaimonia as a qualitatively deeper form of happiness. Aristotle defined as the activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. So eudaimonia, you could translate it as good spirit or good conscience, if you will. So a kind of deeper form of flourishing. So, they would make this distinction 2,500 years ago. And this is probably one of the key distinctions we make in well-being scholarship at the moment. There's others too that haven't really made their mark as such, but the Greeks would talk about a quality called ataraxia, for example. This is in Stoicism around a certain kind of imperturbability and tranquility and not indifference, but the kind of detachment from one's circumstances. So anyway, we do draw on these kind of currents. Then kind of Judeo-Christian heritage. Think about Sermon on the Mount would talk about the attainability of happiness, even to the poor. Because you think about the classical Greeks, there's obviously much to laud about their work, but obviously much we could critique. And they would say certain people couldn't experience flourishing, they were excluded from it. Whereas the message of Christianity would be perhaps more expansive, more people could partake in this happiness. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, and so on. Then we have the era of the Renaissance with a rediscovery of the classical works and the potential and development of humans, and then the Enlightenment, and with ideas around maximizing happiness. So we have these Western ocean currents that the field is situated within and drawing on. So I just briefly have this bullet point at the bottom. What is the West? Because when we talk about the West, we use these generalizations, we use these phrases. But when you start to delve into it, it can become problematic. It occurs to me, for example, the United States is held up as this archetypal, weird or Western country. But many people in America, many Americans are from elsewhere, or their parents or grandparents. Many people from the East are Americans. That kind of complicates this idea of what does it mean to call America Western, and who gets to decide that, and what voices get included or excluded. So even calling the United States the West can be tricky and problematic. So you kind of need caveats for every sentence and every generalization. But to the extent that we can generalize, yes, the United States probably can be considered a Western country, in part because it seems to draw on these kind of ocean currents. So it's within this context that I want to think about the modern era of scholarship into well-being and flourishing unfolding, taking place within this ocean. Just to briefly mention about this kind of wave metaphor, I do like this because some people have other ways of construing it, like in my field, positive psychology, sometimes you hear 1.0, 2.0, which is rather more kind of stepwise, but I like this wave metaphor. It's rather kind of fluid. This idea that kind of things draw and build upon early waves, but it's not that the early waves cease or stop. You know, they carry on, they have their energies, and they carry on. And it's often difficult to say what constitutes a wave. Sometimes there's different ripples, and they create, if there's enough, they might accumulate into a wave, and scholars embrace these, but they're not defined by any particular wave. So just something on that wave metaphor. But within that context, I suggested in this recent paper that we've really seen three coming now into four main waves of wellbeing scholarship. So I'll briefly touch upon these in turn, and then perhaps a future wave, which I'll also mention. So really, I'd say with the first wave was the emergence as distinct fields of psychiatry and psychotherapy. So really their focus was on alleviating and ameliorating mental illness. So Freud described the task as turning hysterical misery into ordinary unhappiness, which is quite something. So I mean, obviously this has deep roots going back centuries. I mean, for example, in the 13th century, there's a founding of a priory in London for the sick and infirm, and from 1403 onwards, this did begin to treat insanity. So, you know, there's obviously deep roots in treating these kind of conditions going back centuries. But really the modern era began in, say, 1808, you know, UK legislation for establishing assignments. Johann Riehl coined the term psychiatry. Later on, we had psychotherapy coined. And really the kind of field is considered to be properly established with Emil Kraepelin's major work in 1883. So this is the first wave. So I'm going to introduce another metaphor for thinking about these different waves. I'm guessing this might be familiar to many of you too. This idea of a continuum between mental illness and mental health. There's issues with this. I'm going to but just to kind of set it up for a start, if we can take this simple continuum, psychiatry and psychotherapy really tended to focus on the negative side, the left-hand side. So bringing people to, if you imagine a notional zero at midpoint, you know, as per Freud's kind of comment, just bringing people at least up to zero. So it's not really focusing on the positive territory, but at least addressing people in the negative territory, trying to kind of cure them or relieve them of their kind of mental illness and distress. It's worth saying quickly that this, you know, this metaphor itself can be considered kind of flawed or kind of somewhat inadequate. So, for example, Corey Keyes, he proposed a dual continuum model. Essentially, this recognizes that people can experience, because the issue with this is this implies you're at some one point on this continuum, whereas obviously we know people are much more complex than that. So, for example, people could be experiencing aspects of mental illness and health at the same time. So that, you know, they're doing well in some ways, they're doing less well in other ways. So you can create this two-dimensional state space if you want. You can give labels, for example, like you might be experiencing no mental illness and kind of really doing well in terms of mental health, perhaps you're thriving. But there's also these other permutations. So you might not have, in the bottom right, for example, you might not have a mental illness per se, but you might not really be kind of touching the heights in any positive sense. And Corey Keyes called this languish. So you can see how there's different permutations. So just to say this singular metaphor is problematic, and it is more complex than that. And just to complicate it even further, because academics love this, my boss and I, we also constructed this matrix. So if you're interested in the reference, it's there. It basically takes this two-dimensional state space, but recognizes for every form of mental illness and for every form of mental health, in terms of mental illness and mental health, there's many different forms. So you can create a grid with any number of different types of mental illness, different types of mental health. So you can create a complex picture in which people are doing well in some ways and less well in others. So this is to make the point that that singular metaphor is flawed and we want to think in a more nuanced way. Nevertheless, we can still say that psychiatry and psychotherapy really are focused on this negative territory, ameliorating mental illness. But then this leads into the second wave, because from really the 20s, the 30s onwards, there was an emergence of scholars really saying we need to pay attention to the positive territory, to the positive aspect of mental life. So Maslow, to invoke this kind of spectrum metaphor, Maslow said, it's as if Freud supplied us a sick half of psychology, and we must now fill it out with a healthy half. So this again has its deep roots in, for example, classical ideas around flourishing and potential that were re-embraced during the Renaissance. But its modern founding was really in the 20s, and Otto Rank broke rank with Freud, and he influenced Rogers and Maslow. So they founded really the field of humanistic psychology from the 40s onwards. So this was really a focus on, psychiatry and psychotherapy was continuing to treat mental illness, but then they were saying we can also turn our attention to qualities like happiness and flourishing and meaning and purpose and anything that might be construed as being in that positive territory of that spectrum. So obviously this still continues to this day. So this is still flourishing in its own terms, but we can call this the second wave. But then from around the 60s onwards, a new wave of what I've called scientific psychology. So if in case there's any humanistic psychologists, this isn't to imply that you aren't scientific, but it's more with humanistic psychology, the emphasis is more on therapeutic practice. But now with the 60s, you find people just focusing on studying well-being and flourishing just for its own sake, scientifically, without kind of stepping away from the therapeutic arena, just the scientific study of these concepts. So again, deep roots, going back to, for example, the Enlightenment and the development of empiricism. But I suppose you can really date the modern founding of this wave to say the 60s. So in the 60s, Hadley Cantrell created his Cantrell ladder. So essentially this asks people to imagine a 10-rung ladder where the bottom rung is basically between the worst and best possible life, and to say, where do you stand on this ladder? So this is still widely used, including in the Gallup World Poll, which I'll come on to, as their main measure of life evaluation, which in turn is considered the main measure of happiness. So are people familiar with the World Happiness Report? So this comes out annually. This is based on Cantrell's ladder item in the Gallup World Poll. So, it was formed back in the 60s, still very influential. But, in the 70s, you had things like Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Framework, creation of different scales in the 1980s, like the Satisfaction Life Scale, and then really culminating, I would say, in the founding of positive psychology in the 1990s. Are people here familiar with positive psychology? This is kind of my background. Before I was at Harvard, I was teaching at the University of East London. I had a master's in applied positive psychology. I will just say, with all of these waves, you can have these intricacies enfolded within the waves. So I haven't got a slide on it here, but some colleagues and I developed the notion of second wave positive psychology because, well, positive psychology has lots of criticisms levied at it. One of them is that it kind of takes a rather simplistic view of, categorizing some things as positive, others as negative, and saying we should simplistically embrace the positive, reject the negative. But then obviously people have started to do more, there's a realization that categorizing things as positive and negative can be much more complex and nuanced. And something could be positively valenced. It could feel good, but actually be counterproductive to well-being. So it's kind of has a negative value. And vice versa. Some emotions could be negatively valenced. They might feel unpleasant, but actually they're helpful to our flourishing. So we had this idea of second wave positive psychology, really to pay attention to these kind of dialectical nuances, the fact that it is complicated. So something like, I've written several papers on like boredom or anger or sadness. They're unpleasant to feel, but actually they have their role even as part of a flourishing life. There's a rich literature, for example, on anger as a moral emotion, and it's like necessary in terms of promoting the good, in terms of society, for example. So you can see how it gets quite nuanced. So even with within these broad waves, there's different intricate kind of waves within them, you might say. So we have this notion of second wave positive psychology, but I'll leave that for now. So we have this broad wave of scientific psychology. But this brings me to really I guess the main thrust of this talk is each of these waves has their issues, right? We saw with psychiatry and psychotherapy, it has its value, but it's really focused on that negative aspect, that negative territory of the spectrum. So in response to the critiques, in response to the limitations, something emerges, kind of a new field, a new wave, a new paradigm that addresses the limitations. So with positive psychology and this scientific psychology, it's very laudable, but it has various critiques leveled at it. And perhaps the dominant one, or one of the main ones, is that it's very Western-centric. And this isn't a charge that's limited to this kind of psychology. It arguably applies across different fields, across the whole of psychology. You know, so this is where we get to essentially a recognition that a lot of the scholarship has been taking place in quite limited cultural contexts, particularly the United States, although, you know, there's that caveat to the extent to which the United States really is Western, but you know what I mean. Most of the research takes place within the United States and often limited to kind of select populations, perhaps college students in particular. It's Western-centric in other ways. You know, the language of the field internationally is English, and that has this impact too in terms of what we study, how we conceptualize things, which I'll come on to too. So in many ways, the study of psychology, and in this context, the study of well-being and flourishing, has been very Western-centric. But obviously people recognize that that's a problem. So really well, I mean, there have been people studying well-being and flourishing in different cultures going back a century and not longer, but recognized as a kind of significant problem within the field of psychology, really from the early 2000s onwards, and particularly with the article in 2010 by Enrich College about psychology being mostly weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So that was 2010. That really made its mark to the extent that, you know, the acronym WEIRD is so widely used now. People acknowledge it's a real problem. I mean, like I say, there was research trying to address this Western centricity before that. So in the 1980s, you had the World Values Survey. In the 2000s, the Gallup World Poll started. So assessing well-being and flourishing across the globe, recognizing the need to get beyond studying people just in the United States and Western Europe. And then some new projects which I'm involved with, which I'll come on to in a bit. So the Global Wellbeing Initiative and the Global Flourishing Study. So I think this is kind of where the field is at in terms of this wave structure. Recognize the limitations of it being very Western-centric and then trying to redress that, getting much better about doing research globally. You've got to be so careful with all this, though. That's not to imply research wasn't being done globally. You know, so it's partly a question of who gets paid attention to, whose voice gets listened to, those kind of power dynamics. So there has been research globally, of course, going back decades, but the field as a whole, you could say, is getting much better at taking that on board, giving it a voice and a platform, just being much more global and cross-cultural in its outlook. So in the second part of this talk, I really want to kind of go into some detail around this new wave of global scholarship. Just briefly though, it's always interesting to think in the future, where might the field be going? So I've suggested recently that there might be an soon to emerge fifth wave of cosmic psychology. I never know how much to talk about this in public. But you know, I mentioned that new waves emerge in response to critiques of earlier waves. So this new wave of global scholarship is emerging, and that's fantastic. But you know, one critique is it's still human-centric. And that's fair enough, because we're humans, we want to study humans. But an increasing awareness and appreciation, we also need to think about the well-being and flourishing of non-human agents of various kinds. So the need to think about organic earth life of different kinds, different animals, different creatures, driven by two needs. So first of all, kind of in a moral sense, I think we do, you know, it's expanding our circle of concern and care to kind of to take the well-being of non-human agents into account. But there's also kind of an enlightened self-interest element, the fact that our well-being does depend on the well-being of other organic earth life. So I think really expanding our attention to consider the well-being of non-humans, I think is an important step. And you kind of start to see this kind of filtering into the field. There's also AI. So obviously this is, we're kind of at the epicenter of that really here. So, you know, development of AI systems and what that means, and are they conscious, and what that might mean in terms of implications, but also responsibilities. So obviously questions around values alignment, I'm sure you're very familiar with this, but also questions around how should we treat AI systems if they are conscious, what kind of responsibilities do we have to ensure their well-being, both in a moral sense and also in terms of enlightened self-interest. And then I won't go down this rabbit hole, tempting though it is, but also thought about kind of extraterrestrial life forms. I don't know what people's thoughts are on that, but you know, if there is intelligent life elsewhere, they are visiting us here, it does raise lots of questions around how we think about the life, how we might want to engage with it if it exists, especially if it comes to interacting with it. So obviously big, open, unknown questions, but it's things we, I think, could and should be thinking about as we go forward. So not just human well-being, but Earth life, AI, extraterrestrials, ultra-terrestrials, and different forms of life. So I think this is something perhaps already is emerging, certainly with respect to AI. This is kind of a hot topic of conversation, but even with the other two, organic Earth life, that goes back to the 60s, an environmental movement. Okay, not many people are talking about the middle one, but I'm trying to, and then other people are interested in it, so maybe this is something that's going to also be an interesting topic going forward. So that's possibly for the future. But for now, you'll kind of want to delve into this this fourth wave of global scholarship. I'm just checking the time. How am I doing? How long have I got left? 40 minutes. Okay, great. Okay, that works out. Okay. So I'd like to kind of delve into this wave of global and cross-cultural wellbeing scholarship, because this is really where the majority of my work is in. So I want to spend some time, first of all, talking about a Global Wellbeing Initiative, which is something I've been involved with since 2019. It's a wonderful project. It's really fascinating. So essentially, it was initiated by a Japanese foundation called Wellbeing for Planet Earth, who partnered with Gallup. So Gallup are the polling organization. And I got brought on board in the early stages to really help with this. And it's been a fantastic project, and it's ongoing. But like I say, it's been initiated in 2019, centered around the development of a new module of items for the Gallup World Poll. So for some context for the Gallup World Poll, since 2005, it's had a survey, around 100 questions, that gets put around the globe, sometimes up to over 150 countries, sometimes slightly fewer. So surveyed annually, kind of a minimum of 1,000 people in each country. So it's not longitudinal per se, it's cross-sectional. It's a different set of people each time. Nevertheless, you really do get a good barometer of, well, all these different aspects of flourishing. So like I say, it's 100 questions. I mean, depending on how broadly you define flourishing, in some sense, they all relate to flourishing. And it's questions about emotions, about life satisfaction, but also about how you feel about your city, social support, friendship networks, can you trust the government? I mean, a really interesting range of questions. And it's been global since 2005. So this has already excelled in addressing the Western centricity to an extent, in terms of the participants at least, because obviously it's a global research, so participants all over the world. But if you're really being kind of critical and harsh, you could still make a case that it's still Western-centric in its ideas and its metrics and how it thinks about well-being, because until very recently, until this initiative, its main metrics for thinking about well-being were Cantrill's ladder of life evaluation, this 10-point ladder scale, and also several around high arousal positive emotions. So it gets tricky here, because it's not that these are just Western ideas. I mean, they're relevant globally. People understand them globally. People answer them. They resonate with them. But the question is whether these capture everything we would wish to know about well-being, or are we missing out on some concepts, some ideas, some insights into well-being that tend to be emphasized in other cultures. So I mentioned its main metrics for emotions were high arousal positive emotions. But people like Jian Tsai have made a case that there's cultural differences in preferences for affect. And there's a tendency, they argued, in Western cultures to prefer high arousal positive emotions, value them, to seek them, and so on. Whereas they would say in Eastern cultures, there's a leaning towards valuing and preferring low arousal positive emotions, like peace and calmness. And it does get complicated, because I'm not saying these are Eastern either, because they apply and are relevant in the West too. But at the very least, you can make the case that these have been generally overlooked from a lot of well-being scholarship. So that's what I mean when I say that until recently, even though the Gallup World Poll was global, the way it looked at well-being and assessed it could be considered somewhat Western-centric. So this Japanese foundation had a great interest in saying, well, actually, let's try and learn from other cultures. They were obviously interested in Japan and Eastern cultures more generally, being Japanese, but also just extending the net more broadly to say, are we missing out on any insights into what it means to experience and seek flourishing? So it's come to be that the module has become centered on balance and harmony. So much I could say balance and harmony. I mean, there's such fascinating concepts. Again, what I will say now is, I don't want to characterize these as Eastern concepts, because there's traditions in the West of valuing balance and harmony, and likewise. So I'm not going to pigeonhole them as Eastern concepts, but I think you can still make the case that they have received greater value, greater attention, greater respect in Eastern cultures, and less so in Western cultures. I mean, you get some interesting territory here, because I've recently been thinking about the difference between two approaches in terms of what it means for something to be good and how we should approach it. So I would argue that the West has been dominating what you could call a maximalist approach. Okay, so if something is good, then just more of it is better, right? So this you could call a maximalist approach. Not always, but this has been kind of the driving, I guess, tendency within the West. But this is in contrast to what you might call an optimizing approach, where it's about finding the right amount of something. So it's not the case that exercise is good, so more exercise is just simply better, and you just keep doing more and more, and that's how you go. But it's about finding the right amount, so balancing between doing too little and too much. And this applies to so many things: food, sleep, the rest, to socializing. I mean, when you think about it, it's very hard to say something is good, so more of it is intrinsically better. It's about trying to find, I would argue, trying to find the right amount. This is like an optimizing approach. But it's fundamentally in tension with a maximalizing approach. So the fact that the West has leaned towards a maximizing approach, I think has hindered it from looking at kind of this optimizing perspective. Whereas I think, I make a case that Eastern cultures, they've leaned more towards an optimizing approach. I mean, it's reflected in, for example, traditions like Taoism with the yin-yang symbol, recognizing these types of insights, which I think have been really missing from, well, academia, perhaps the West more generally. So obviously balance and harmony are integral to this notion of an optimizing approach. So beginning in 2019, this initiative emerged. We put our first set of questions into the 2020 Gallup World Poll. I think this is probably too small for you to see, is that right? I'll just quickly run through the questions. So we had a question on calmness. So again, filling in that gap around low arousal, positive emotions. Did you feel calmness a lot of the day yesterday, yes or no? Would you rather live an exciting life or a calm life? In fact, just get curious what people here would say. Who would rather live an exciting life than a calm life? Who'd go for exciting? Who would go for calm? Oh, okay. That's good. Okay. A question around peace. So again, that's around kind of low arousal, positive states. In general, do you feel at peace with your life or not? One question around balance. In general, do you feel the various aspects of your life are in balance? A question around meaning, but that's also intended to tap into the distinction between individualism and collectivism. Are you familiar with that distinction? You know, the notion that the West is individualistic, and in other cultures maybe tend towards more collectivist orientation. This gets interesting too. There's all these nuances. I'll come into that, but we intended this question to partly tap into that distinction. So, which of the following is closest to your main purpose in life? Being good at what you do in your daily life. We kind of coded that as somewhat individualistic. Caring for family and close friends, or helping other people who need help. So kind of two options that kind of arguably tap more into collectivism. And then another question, again, tapping into individualism versus collectivism. Do you think people should focus more on taking care of themselves, which we coded as individualistic, or on taking care of others, which we coded as collectivistic? So actually, when we get to the results, it's really fascinating. So I'll come on to that shortly, but that's the 2020 set of items. We revised them for the 2021 World Poll. So we retained the one on calmness and balance. We changed the framing slightly. So now it's, in general, how often do you feel each of the following? So we had balance, contentment, peace, vitality, which we asked about by using the word enthusiastic, connected to nature, connected to a religion or form of spirituality. You have a good relationship with your loved ones, and resilience. So you're able to deal with life challenges. So by this point, we weren't really focused on balance and harmony. We were still kind of really just casting a fairly wide net in terms of asking about items and concepts that interested us. But by the 2022 poll, we'd really honed in on balance and harmony, something that's really central and important and also missing from a lot of the scholarship. So partly from our own, it's us finding this interesting, but conversations in the field, people saying, well, it's really interesting you're asking about balance and harmony because this has been missing and we really value the work you're doing. So various reasons we kind of honed in on this balance and harmony theme, together with these low arousal positive states, which are kind of intimately connected in interesting ways to balance and harmony. So we had 2 questions around balance. Are the various aspects of your life in balance? So that's retained from the other years. An interesting one that's more trying to get at this notion of that optimizing approach. So how often do you feel the amount of things happening in your life is just right? Not too much and not too little. So again, it's trying to get to this idea that some qualities, it's about finding the balance between too little and too much, rather than just something's good, more of it the better, the maximizing approach. 2 questions around harmony. How often are you in harmony with those around you? How often are your thoughts and feelings in harmony? One around kind of emotional stability, which arguably has kind of low arousal dimension. Do you feel stable and secure in your life? Are you content? Is your mind at ease? Can you feel inner peace during difficult times? So, as you can imagine, with these different 3 sets of items, up to 150 countries, some 200,000 people each year, it's an amazing data set because, sometimes we approach these ideas based on expectations, intuitions, stereotypes, generalizations, but you actually get the data, and it's really fascinating, often very surprising. The world is complex, and that shows up in the data. It doesn't cleave to our neat generalizations. So I'll just give a sampling of some of our findings. If you're interested in one of the write-ups, we did a chapter in the 2022 World Happiness Report based on our 2020 items, particularly the balance one, but also the low arousal positive emotions. But it's really interesting. So to begin with, you can just simply rank countries in terms of the percentage of the population saying they do experience balance. So here's the balance rankings. I mean, would have predicted Malta would be top. I mean, I don't know much about Malta. I mean, it seems like a beautiful place, but the fact that that's top is interesting. But then, once you start to look at the data, it becomes quite interesting. I mean, would anyone here notice any patterns about the top 10 or the bottom 10? So here's the top 10, and on the other side, going down to Zimbabwe is the lowest. So that's kind of the bottom ranked countries. Any kind of patterns jump out at you? Yeah, I mean, kind of the weird countries there. I mean, one thing we emphasized in the chapter in the write-up, there seems to be a strong socio-economic dimension. The fact that the people experiencing high levels of balance, they tend to be, affluent European countries, and those with low level might be kind of more materially challenged, mostly African countries. So, at the very least, there seems to be a socio-economic dimension to the experiencing balance. I mean, any one of these, it's a fascinating story. It doesn't seem to reflect necessarily onto East versus West either. I mean, other than the top 10 are mainly Western countries, but here's the peace rankings. Maybe something similar there. So again, just to remind you of the question, in general, do you feel at peace with your life or not? So here we have Netherlands. Almost 98% of people do feel at peace with their life. But slightly less Eurocentric. Here we have Taiwan and Saudi Arabia in the top 10. The bottom ranked countries, again, tend to be the poorer African countries, which again shows you that there might be a socio-economic dimension to this type of question too. So experience calmness. Did you feel calmness a lot of the yesterday? So here though, it's interesting, you get away from the kind of Eurocentric top 10 of the previous 2 items. So here it's topped by Vietnam, Jamaica, the Philippines, Kyrgyzstan. So it's hard to kind of, you can see it's hard to kind of summarize and pick out strong patterns because these rankings and data themselves are so rich. But it's just interesting, I think, looking at the rankings. And again, here the bottom 10 ranked countries, again, slightly more variation compared to balance and peace. This is the preference for calmness. So would you rather live an exciting life or a calm life? So yeah, Congo, Brazil. So again, you can make a case that there is a socio-economic dimension here, as in places that are perhaps more materially deprived or challenged in various ways. You might prefer calmness because if life is chaotic, that might be more desirable. And perhaps it's a case that if life is more secure, stable, and safe, then you have the kind of comfort of wanting to a more exciting life. So you can see those kind of dynamics might play out. We also had an interesting, we tried to look at the permutations of the two calmness items. So again, a preference for calmness, would you rather experience, have a calm life or an exciting life? And also, did you experience calmness yesterday, to create 4 permutations? So if you preferred calm life and experienced it, we call this satisfied calmness. So 53.1% had that. If you preferred calmness but didn't get to experience it yesterday, we call that longed for calmness. If you experienced it but would have preferred excitement, we call that unwanted calmness. And then if you preferred excitement and didn't experience calmness anyway, then we call that unmissed calmness. So you can get these interesting permutations. Again, it's probably too small for you to see from there, but it's so interesting just to compare the different regions in terms of preferences for calmness, experiences of calmness, and also these 4 permutations. So, I was making the point that there is that suggestion in the scholarship that low arousal positive emotions are more highly kind of valued and sought and cultivated in Eastern cultures than Western cultures. But here it's really interesting if you look at preferences for calmness, higher in the West and Eastern regions, experiences of calmness, again, higher in Western and Eastern countries. So to some extent, these kind of overturn our expectations around, where people both would prefer and also experience calmness. But then, again, we've got to introduce these caveats because it can sometimes be misleading simply just to look at figures because what's going on beneath the figures. So for example, let's say there's apparently lower levels of experienced calmness in Eastern cultures than Western cultures. You could make a case, though, that such is their emphasis of low arousal positive states, their traditions of cultivating these meditative practices, for example, but they have a higher bar for what constitutes calmness. So perhaps it's, perhaps when they're answering this question, they have a higher bar for actually what constitutes calmness. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have lower levels of calmness. It just means that's how they're interpreting the question and answering it in this context. So you still want to be wary of these kind of generalizations about saying, well, this means that people are calmer in the West and the East because, perhaps they're judging it differently or interpreting it differently. So there are these nuances to bear in mind. But even so, it is interesting the way these kind of data tended to overturn at least our own expectations and so on. Just to briefly give you some examples of these permutations. So satisfied calmness. So people who prefer calmness and experienced it. Top there is Jamaica, Nicaragua, Tanzania. So it's really interesting once you get into these permutations. Unwanted calmness, so people who experience calmness but preferred excitement. That was topped by Vietnam. Longed for calmness, where you preferred to experience calmness but didn't. So top ranked country there was Nepal. And then unmissed calmness, where you preferred excitement and didn't experience calmness anyway the day before. And that was topped by Israel. So you could spend hours, as you can imagine, looking over these ranking tables, looking at different, every one of these countries, it's just an interesting story you'd want to delve into anyway. Why do they rank highly on this and not on that? Why do they compare like this? Compared to another country, why are they higher than that, and so on. So there's so much, data is so rich. So I'm just giving you kind of brief selection. I think the overriding theme, though, is that the data tended to challenge our preconceived notions, our preconceived expectations. This is a good example too. So I mentioned about those 2 questions that tapped into individualism versus collectivism. So just to refresh your memory, you had one question, do you think people should focus more on taking care of themselves or on taking care of others? And then which of the following is closest to your main purpose in life? Being good at what you do, caring for family and close friends, or helping other people who need help. So to our surprise, really, say we take the first question, do you feel should people focus more on taking care of themselves or on taking care of others? We had assumed that people saying taking care of themselves is the kind of individualistic option. But people selecting, the levels of people selecting was higher in Eastern cultures than Western cultures. So 45% of people in the East said people should, in Eastern cultures, said people should focus more on taking care of themselves compared to 41% in the West. That's really interesting. So, I mean, we did this paper trying to explore these nuances. Does that mean we're wrong about assuming the West is more individualistic than the East? Like it might do. We might genuinely be wrong about that assumption. But it also becomes complicated. We had a lot of back and forth with the reviewers because they were like, well, actually, for example, maybe selecting taking care of oneself could be collectivistic because you might think, I don't want to be a burden on others. So, you know, there's different interpretations. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is individualistic and collectivistic in the way we'd assume. But even so, that kind of was good food for thought in terms of what we mean by individualism, because, you know, if your individualism means you answer, I think people should focus more on taking care of others, that's just interesting. You know, that was higher in the West than Eastern cultures. So that in itself gets us away from these simplistic generalizations about the West as individualistic. So again, the data is super nuanced and just really fascinating. We had all these permutations too around taking care of themselves versus taking care of others, and those questions around what you prefer to do, being good at what you do in your daily life, caring for family and close friends, helping other people who need help. So again, lots of nuance and kind of interesting dynamics going on. So if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to read that paper I shared there, Complexifying Individualism versus Collectivism, and West versus East. So it's such a fascinating project, it really is. So I mean, I'm happy to take questions on this at the end. But I think that's all I'll say on that for now. Just to mention a couple of other projects I'm involved with. There's a new study being led by Harvard, by my boss Tyler Vanderwill at Harvard, called the Global Flourishing Study. And it's a hugely ambitious project involving some 200,000 people across 22 countries. What's really unique about this is the longitudinal design, because the Gallup World Poll is longitudinal in some senses. You're asking about the same countries year on year, but it's different people each time. So what's, you know, that makes it hard, obviously, to make any kind of determinations about causality and so on. But the strength of this project is it's a longitudinal design where we're tracking the same people across a minimum of 5 years. A really expansive range of items. I think it's actually 105, so kind of similar to the Gallup World Poll, covering, and what's interesting, most concepts are assessed with a single item. You're covering roughly some 100 concepts. So it uses our items on balance and on peace, and there's just many others. So it's a really expansive breadth of coverage in terms of really all aspects of life when you think about it, most aspects of life. It's a really it's a global endeavor, because I think this is really important as well. I didn't really mention this before, but when we're talking about global scholarship, this isn't simply a case of like Western scholars like myself engaging with other countries and looking at their data, but it's about kind of global collaboration and partnership, about scholars in those countries, about partnerships, about working with them, about harnessing, you know, their talents and strengths, and really this kind of co-production and working together. It's not simply us looking to other countries. So this is a really kind of nice global endeavor. This includes, for example, you know, satellite groups in these participating countries to help us explore issues around translation, interpretation, and so on. How am I doing for time? 10 minutes? Okay. And then just briefly, this project I've had on the go for since 2015, 2016. Creation of a positive lexicography. So I'm not a linguist, and I'm not sure what linguists think of this project. But I'm really fascinated by language, and particularly by this notion of untranslatable words. So I mentioned about spending time in China when I was 19, and then encountering concepts that I really had I struggled to understand. You know, words that I might call untranslatable, like the Tao in Chinese, or if you're thinking about, you know, Buddhism, you know, words like nirvana, Sanskrit word nirvana. Sometimes we use those words in the original form. We've adopted them as loan words in English, but, you know, an awareness back then of these concepts in other languages that, well, we can call them untranslatable. Linguists have an issue with this term untranslatable because some think, well, you can kind of translate it. It just might take a sentence or a paragraph. And then again, some linguists think that no word is truly translatable. You're always missing out on something, some nuances, some levels of meaning. But roughly speaking, I use untranslatable to mean there's a word in another language that doesn't have an exact equivalent in English. And this notion of exact equivalency can take different forms. Like something like the towel, that has nothing close to it really in English, arguably. But sometimes you can have untranslatability of different forms. So for example, in Greek, there's many different words relating to types of love. And you could just translate them all as love. And it's kind of sort of not wrong, but it's also not particularly accurate either because you're missing out on these nuances. So basically, back in 2015, I had this experience of, I was at a conference in Florida, and there was a Finnish researcher giving a talk about a Finnish concept called sisu, which kind of roughly translates as extraordinary grit and determination. And she was making the point that, you know, you can convey something of the feeling of that concept with those terms, with word grit, but you know, you're missing out on a lot. And so her PhD was centered on what does sisu mean? How does it show up in Finnish culture and identity? What are the different dimensions? And then she was arguing, you know, this is missing from our psychological lexicon. We should add it to our, you know, set of concepts and ideas in the field. And for some reason, I guess, you know, the seeds have been planted back in my experiences in China, but somehow this crystallized it. And then, you know, I got home and I was actually talking to my mum about the conference. And then we had this whole conversation about, well, that's interesting that we don't have that word in English. And then my mum speaks a bunch of languages, so she thought of other words that we don't have in English that are also interesting and meaningful and relevant. So by the end of that conversation, I decided to create a collection of untranslatable words relating to well-being and flourishing, with this idea of we're just exploring them, you know, engaging with them as a means of expanding our idea of what it means to flourish and to be well, to help enrich our conceptual map and psychology. You know, I mentioned at the start of this talk, when I was in China, realizing there was a really detailed theory of the mind, you know, in Buddhism and lots of Chinese words and Sanskrit words relating to Buddhist psychology that are untranslatable. They weren't in the psychology that I was studying, and that by engaging with these kind of words, we could have a much deeper, you know, understanding of the mind, different aspects of, particular aspects of the mind that were being overlooked. So this project to kind of collect and engage with and analyze these type of words, because there's so much you could say about this, but this idea that another culture has identified a phenomenon to the extent that they've given it a label, and we haven't in English, means we've either overlooked it or ignored it or not appreciated it. And so by engaging with those terms, we can see what's missing from our own understanding of the mind and of well-being and so on. So it's this ongoing project. It's kind of simmering away. I kind of keep going back to it. It's over 1,800 words so far. The way I try to approach these words is really thematically. You know, I'm very wary about generalizations. So for example, I do want to collect, here's all the Japanese words and here's what I can say about Japanese culture based on these. You know, I don't like those kind of generalizations. I'm trying to rather group these together thematically. So, you know, so to see among the different words how they can add to our understanding of that particular theme. So I've created, what we say, 12 broad categories grouped into 3 meta categories. So there's qualia, which is, you know, that includes positive emotions, ambivalent emotions, cognition, and embodiment. There's a meta category of relationships that includes love, pro-sociality, eco-connection, so relationship to nature, and aesthetics. I'm not sure aesthetics belongs in relationships, but it seems awkward to put it anywhere else. So, you know, I shoehorned it in there. And then kind of development. So that has categories of character, spirituality, competence, and understanding. And then you can zoom in on any one of these categories. So just to give a brief example, the category of positive emotions, this has 7 themes. And then each of these themes has lots of sub-themes based on the words. So the first theme at the very top there is peace and calmness. So there's like loads of different concepts relating to peace and calmness, but they all kind of tease out different aspects of it. So there's sati, which is actually the Pali term that's the basis for mindfulness. So mindfulness is some might say an inadequate translation for this Pali term sati, which is a kind of relaxed attentiveness. Although even that doesn't really capture it because these are untranslatable after all. You know, for example, sati has like an ethical dimension that doesn't really come through in mindfulness. as a word, or that particular description. There's words around tranquility, there's words around acceptance. So I have this theme of like peace and calmness, but again, all these constructs kind of tease out different aspects or elements of that. So it's one I love doing. I love doing it. Like I said, I'm not a linguist. I just find it fascinating and really meaningful. And it's been a way for me to connect with other cultures, other languages, scholars from other cultures. They got in touch. I collaborated with some people, for example, in relation to kind of Japanese words. So this is an ongoing project. If you're interested in it, I did write a book on it a few years ago. I'm not trying to sell this to you. I haven't sold many. This is with MIT Press. So this is translating happiness, but also, I don't have it here, but I have a website. The whole project is on my website. You can see all the words, this interactive thing there. So you don't have to buy anything. You can just, if you're interested, it's www.drtimlomas.com/lexicography if you're interested. I do have a third section. Do I have time for this? Briefly, okay. I thought I'd just share this with you because, you know, recently with my boss, Tyler Vanderweel, this incredible scholar, we've been working through trying to construct a map that kind of ties together, you know, the research that exists around flourishing, the thinking we've been doing. Okay, there's so much here. 10, 15 minutes. All right, I don't have to rush too much. Okay. One thing we've been trying to do with the map is to provide a set of working definitions that are kind of internally consistent. Because, you know, sometimes we use words like health, happiness, flourishing, well-being, thriving, and sometimes they're interchangeable and sometimes they're synonymous and sometimes it's not clear, you know, what they refer to. So we tried to construct sets of definitions for all of these terms using the same keywords within the definitions so that they can kind of, it's internally consistent in terms of mapping out the conceptual space as far as we see it. So some of the definitions sound a bit odd on their own, but it kind of all makes sense internally. So the heart of the map really are the notions of health and well-being. It gets tricky almost straight away, but they both have kind of two different definitions, two main uses and definitions. So one is like the quality of one's personal state. There's kind of conceptual space to how a person is faring in life. Then also it's the desirable aspect of that space. So a personal state of quality. It's like the way, you know, height refers to orientation in space, but you call something high, it means it's at the top. So health and well-being have that same kind of implication. It's the whole space, but when you say someone has health, has well-being, it's the kind of the desirable aspect of that space. So just to go into some of these key terms, personal, state, quality. Personal, that's because we view health and well-being as a property of sentient agents, which differs in our terminology for flourishing, which is broader, more expansive, can pertain to non-human systems, and so on. So a state, it's a modal condition that's not permanent, but can vary widely in duration. And quality, so a fundamental and even irreducible sense of a phenomenon being deemed good or valuable in some way. I'm not sure if people here have read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but anyway, I love that book, and he taught that's centered on this notion of quality as this notion of something that's the heart of his vision. Something, yeah, this definition here. So I wanted to kind of embrace that as a kind of central term. It's a state of quality. Okay. The way we differentiate health and well-being, I mean, this is contentious. I could spend a lot of time just on this one slide, but the way we try to differentiate them was in terms of the distinction between ontological objectivity versus subjectivity. So, because you often hear the phrase health and well-being. What does that mean? It doesn't mean, it's not that health is physical and well-being is mental, because you have mental health, so it gets complicated. So the main way we could differentiate them was that health, when you see health being used, it's often referred to like the objective condition of the body. And well-being tends to imply it's more about kind of subjective, you know, phenomenology and qualia. So that's the way we kind of disentangle these two terms. So health is more ontologically objective. So it's about our materiality. So the aspects of phenomena which exist as physical objects or processes. And well-being is more subjective. It's about qualia. So we have health and well-being. So Now we can recognize there's different dimensions to existence. So here's another kind of ontological framework. We've already had the ontological distinction between subjectivity and objectivity. But here's kind of another ontological way of carving up terrain between different dimensions of existence. So we've embraced the WHO definition of health. So they describe health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. Okay, so that implies three main ontological dimensions: physical, mental, and social. And then some people think you should add the spiritual to that. So we call that the WHO plus framework for ontological dimensions. So physical, mental, social, and spiritual. And then just to say, this is orthogonal to this other ontological distinction, because I think all of these four dimensions, they can have ontologically subjective aspects, how we experience them qualitatively, and ontologically objective. You know, for example, like a broken ankle is a physical issue, and anxiety is a mental issue. Both of those have ontologically objective aspects of our physiology, and then also ontologically subjective aspects. Okay, so they're the four dimensions. And so you can take those definitions we had earlier, like mental state of quality, and just apply them to the different dimensions by putting relevant adjective in. So mental health and well-being, the quality of one's mental state and mental state of quality, and then mental ill health and ill-being is a mental state lacking quality. So you can see how you're taking these just generic definitions for health and well-being and then positioning them as being relevant to particular dimensions. But then you can zoom in further. So basically, the terrain of mental well-being, the positive terrain, we've given the broad label happiness. So basically the entirety of that terrain. Because, you know, some people use happiness in a more specific or narrow way. It's just about pleasure and so on. I think that's fine. We've used happiness in a much more expansive sense to really cover the entire positive territory of the mental dimension. And so in a recent paper, we teased apart 16 different forms. I mean, it's probably not 16. It depends on how you aggregate them, you know, because I mentioned before the distinction between hedonic and eudaimonic happiness. So arguably, you could fit most of these into one of those two buckets, and there's a few left over. But we think it's actually more useful to take them out of those buckets and can just consider them separately. There's probably more. But the reason I want to just show this is because this is our attempt at engaging with the other literature, because this hedonic eudaimonic distinction, like I said, you know, dates back to classical Greece, but it overlooks many other ideas around well-being and happiness found in other cultures. So, for example, there's a scholar called Paul Wong, Chinese in origin, lives in Canada most of his life, and he's done a lot of work around kind of looking at kind of Eastern ideas around happiness and then developing notions of happiness. Like I said, they don't really neatly fall into this hedonic eudaimonic binary. So we try to engage with his work and work of other people to expand our taxonomy, expand our conception of what it means to be happy. So identifying 16 different forms here, but like I said, there's probably more. You know, as we engage with other cultures, this list could be refined and added to. Just to briefly, you know, give you a sample of them, we've grouped them into three main areas, whether they're primarily centered on feelings, thinking, or doing. So even just there, you can see how we've been more expansive, in that some people would just think happiness is purely about feelings, but we've tried to identify forms of happiness that, you know, don't primarily involve feeling. Perhaps feeling isn't particularly involved at all. I don't know if people here are familiar with the notion of flow. Csikszentmihalyi's notion of flow. So arguably that's a type of happiness. We've called it absorbed happiness, but you know, experiences of flow, they don't really center on affect and feelings at all. It's more about intention and engagement and absorption and so on. So just to give you a sample, we've got 5 types of feeling type definitions. So hedonic. So we take that root definition, the desired mental experience of quality with respect to one's present emotions and feelings, with a particular emphasis on higher arousal varieties. And then contented, which is the same, but with an emphasis on lower arousal varieties. Mature happiness. So this is a construct proposed by Paul Wong, who I just mentioned. So this is to do with the way one is kind of engaged with the suffering in one's life. You know, he's drawn a lot on the work of Viktor Frankl, for example, as well as Buddhism. He's created this notion of mature happiness, which is really interesting. Chironic happiness, another of Paul Wong's notions. So this is more of a kind of spiritual type of happiness. He describes it with notions like grace, experiences of grace, and so on. And then vital happiness, really kind of engaging with our felt sense of being a body, sense of vitality and enthusiasm. So there's thinking definitions, doing definitions. I'm just going to quickly skip ahead though. We have these 16 different types. So we drilled into the mental dimension, the positive territory, which we label happiness, have these 16 types of happiness. But now I want to kind of sort of zoom out slightly to finish by showing what we mean by flourishing. Because, okay, we have these 4 dimensions of well-being. So 4 dimensions of existence. And you can think about well-being and health in relation to those dimensions. So we have physical, mental, social, and spiritual health and well-being. And, you could imagine assessing them, I've constructed these spokes, 6 or 7 spokes for each type. There's different types of physical well-being, mental well-being, spiritual well-being, social well-being. There's different levels. You can imagine experiencing them in different degrees. But then just want to finish that by noting that we should ideally also zoom out to consider the context in which people are situated. There's another critique of flourishing well-being scholarship and positive psychology. It's very individualistic. It tends to look at well-being as a property of individual people. It doesn't pay much attention to the systemic and social and cultural context in which people are situated that might impose barriers upon people in terms of whether they can experience flourishing. So we tried to zoom out to say we actually do need to pay attention to these contextual factors too. So flourishing for us is all the dimensions of well-being and all the factors that influence this. So it pertains to the individual and the context in which they're situated. So like a definition of flourishing we use is a personal and systemic state of quality in relation to all dimensions of existence in a way that's relatively enduring and well supported by the various conditions of life. Because when you think about well-being, people can experience well-being even amid, great adversity, very challenging situations. So you could be, the city in which you live could be in a disastrous state, but for whatever reason, you're able to experience levels of well-being. But we would say you can't really properly, truly flourish if your environment isn't also doing well. If you're walking past homeless people, if there's kind of issues relating to climate and so on, if the world is in trouble, you're not really flourishing because that depends on the environment in which you're situated also doing well. And, that's partly a moral claim in as much as we also need to pay attention to those dimensions. We can't just ignore what's around us. But it's also, I think, a comment on what it means to flourish, as in we might be able to attain a certain level of well-being and irrespective or even in spite of what's going on around us. If we flourish, we're embedded within contexts, and those contexts also need to be doing well. And if they're not, then we can't truly flourish. And I would say this notion of flourishing helps draw our attention to context, both in terms of how we theorize and study well-being, but also how we act. There's a kind of injunction to kind of promote the well-being, to ensure the context in which we're situated is also attended to and doing well. So just briefly to close out with the map, we have the 4 dimensions of well-being and health and well-being at the heart, but then we've tried to give a sense of the ways in which these are influenced. So we tried to identify different layers of the person. I mean, we selected 5 layers here, but that's just a kind of slightly arbitrary number. But you can imagine there's emotions, cognition, behavior, and so on. There's all these personal factors that filter through these layers to influence our well-being. So these are 10 that I think are particularly salient. This isn't an exhaustive list. There's probably more. But at the very least, when you think about the impact of physiology, temperament and personality, age and development, sex and gender, race and ethnicity, motivation, will, cognition, intelligence, thoughts, beliefs, values, choices, behavior, action. These are all factors that influence our well-being. And they filter through the different layers of the person. So for example, just in terms of temperament, this is going to show up in various ways in my emotions, my cognition, my awareness, my attention, my memory, my perception. So these are the layers of the person, and these factors filter through all these layers to influence our well-being in complex ways. Then we can also think about kind of environmental factors. So first of all, we layered the environment using Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, which I'm sure people may be familiar with. He identifies different layers to the environment in which we're situated. It begins with a microsystem, so our immediate social setting, our family, our workplace, our class. That's the microsystem. Mesosystem is the interaction between microsystems. So kind of work-life balance, for example, is a mesosystemic phenomenon. And there's the exosystem, is the community in which we're situated. The macrosystem is kind of the wider society in which we're placed. And then on top of that, we added the ecosystem. That's kind of more the natural environment in which even macrosystems are situated. And then we can just recognize that through all of these levels of the kind of socio-cultural context, there's different factors that would influence our well-being, including family and friends, community, resources, infrastructure, economics, distribution and comparison, disadvantage, discrimination, governance, politics, traditions, language, nature, environment. So again, these are all environmental factors that will filter through in different ways the levels of the environment. So for example, just to take one factor, we think about economics. There's the economics of our microsystem. Is our particular family well off or not? But then there's the economics of our exosystem, the community in which we're situated, the macrosystem, and so on. So any one of these factors filters through the different levels or layers of this kind of socio-cultural context that shape our well-being in complex ways. And then at the end, you can imagine like a map, an individualized map where you can chart the extent to which a person is experiencing the different aspects of well-being to different levels. And then the influences of all those factors filtering through the different layers. So I don't have a reference for it here, but we just published a paper that kind of summarizes the map. It's called A Flexible Map of Flourishing. That's just come out if you're interested to read that. So I've just raced through it here, but I wanted to give you a sample of some of the work we've been doing in trying to tie together the thinking relating to the scholarship, these different waves of scholarship that I shared earlier in the talk. Trying to find a way to tie them all together, because there's a lot of data, there's a lot of ideas, and hopefully we can somehow weave them together in a somewhat coherent way. Okay, and that's me. Thank you. So I think we've got no idea what time it is. We've got some time for questions, right? Yeah. I don't know if there's a mic to go around, or if you just want to. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try and summarize it for, in case people didn't hear it. So the notion that, in different cultures, particularly in indigenous cultures, the notion of enlightenment, which relates to concepts of self and the presence of self, and the extent to which one's sense of selfhood might influence flourishing, does that, it's a great question, and it's hard to answer because it partly turns on what you mean by self, of course. That sounds like I'm trying to get out of answering. I think on the whole, the less one is kind of concerned with one's sense of self, fixated or preoccupied with oneself, I think the better you'll be doing. I do think the extent that we are thinking about oneself, then that tends to be limiting. Can lead to a lot of anxiety and negative emotions. It's no accident that a lot of the contemplative traditions are about either deconstructing or transcending one's sense of self, or at least it gets complicated, or expanding it. So perhaps your sense of itself, it's still there, but you've transcended it. So it's not that you've forgotten about yourself, but you have a wider sphere of concern. So there's care for other people, and that could expand ever outwards. So some models of psychological development are about this expansion of one's sphere of concern and one's sense of self. So it's not that one sense of self has been removed, but it's just become expanded so that other people are sort of encompassed within that. And there's much more of an intersubjectivity there. So it's not that one cares less about oneself, but one's sense of self itself has got bigger. But I do think that the narrow sense of selfhood, like this is me, the kind of self-narration that goes on, this is me, Tim, and what am I doing today? And that concern with myself, to the extent that I'm fixated and preoccupied with my own, you know, my own identity, my own story, I do think that that's not conducive to flourishing. And that, you know, it can be helpful to find ways to either diminish that self-preoccupation or kind of expand it so it embraces other people. But I also think lots more work does need to be done. I mean, that's always a kind of, that's always the answer too. Like, we do need more research on this and all topics, but I do think genuinely in terms of, for example, we talk about the practices in different cultural traditions, but there's you know, such differences between these cultural traditions. So I think it's going to be fascinating to try and, you know, work out what are the nuances. Like, there's so many different meditative practices that kind of deal with the self in different ways. And then we, you know, need much more research into the differences among those different practices to see which, you know, in an empirical sense, which could be more conducive to flourishing. But as a general sense, I think your intuition there is correct. The more you can kind of get beyond or transcend or get past one's own sense of self, that is better for one's flourishing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think you're thinking about the project led by Robert Waldinger. He's the latest director. I mean, the longitudinal study that's been run out of Harvard, I think that's been, I mean, that's decades now, going back to, I think, 60 or 70 years. And that is you're right, that is the conclusion. What we're doing, obviously, is influenced by that and inspired by that, but it's a different project. In fact, ours is just beginning. In fact, just a few weeks ago, we got the first wave of data. So it was only implemented in the past year. And we're currently in the process of analyzing and, you know, writing papers about the data. But I think, you know, I think the insights of that project you're mentioning, the longitudinal project, that did show the kind of well-being and flourishing was so pivotally dependent on relationships. I think that will be borne out in the data. But yeah, this project is new and it's quite exciting to be involved with. There's a massive team of us. Our director, Tyler Vanderweel, he's constructed there's a very kind of intricate way in which we're analyzing the data, because it's 22 countries, but such other differences in countries, it can be hard to compare them. So essentially every person is taking one concept or a couple of concepts and then focusing on that particular concept across all the countries. But then each paper will essentially be a meta-analysis, treating each country as a separate study and then doing a meta-analysis of those studies. And that's the kind of basis of these individual papers. So I'm doing papers focusing on balance and happiness and peace, well, papers for each of those. But it's kind of meta-analysis of the separate countries, as it were. I think so, yeah. I mean, what's interesting though about this global flourishing study, you know, because I think, you know, there's a good series of questions around relationships, so we can try and tease apart, you know, I think it's a given that kind of good relationships promote flourishing, but kind of which aspects of relationships, we can try and tease that apart. But then also to acknowledge that it's not just about relationships, because, you know, that's just one dimension of the study and of this kind of conception of flourishing developed by Tyler Vanderweel. So there's also about, you know, physical, you know, dimensions I was talking about here, physical and mental health, questions around religion and spirituality. Obviously, that they all touch upon relationships. So it's a kind of much broader conception of flourishing than just relationships. But I think you're right; they'll end up being central. But it'll be interesting to see the nuances and perhaps also not just the nuances about relationships in itself, but also between different countries. perhaps different dimensions of relationships matter more in some countries than others, among different demographics, different age groups, for example. So I think the data is going to be so rich and fascinating. But you're right, though. Essentially, relationships will end up being kind of a key theme. Yeah. I think there certainly can be a tension. We do exist in a society that does promote certain messages about, where we ought to or could and should find happiness and well-being. Obviously, there's a strong kind of consumer materialistic element to these messages, to these kind of ideologies. It's difficult because I do think we are kind of battling against some of these forces that tend to hinder these deeper forms of well-being, particularly the extent to which things like social media is kind of governed or kind of influenced by dynamics around such as consumerism. So I think we do have to slightly fight against that. But at the same time, I think people do have a good sense of, I think they know better themselves than perhaps what some of these algorithms would drive them towards, what's actually beneficial for them. I mean, there is a sense of kind of pushing against some of these forces that do seem to hinder our happiness and well-being. So as to how we change those forces, how we change these cultural dynamics that, like I say, do tend to hinder our well-being, that's a tricky question, because it's hard to know what drives these forces and these influences and how they could be altered for the better. Like, there's so much commentary on the nature of algorithms, for example, on social media, and how they might be inimical or counterproductive to well-being. But then the question of how to actually change the nature of those algorithms so that it might lead us towards other outcomes or other goods or other values, it seems to be really tricky, even for people who are in charge of them, like the heads of these social media companies and the dynamics and pressures they're under. So I don't think I have a good answer other than we have to keep, we have to keep trying to work out better ways of living, essentially. I mean, that's kind of human condition, kind of work out how to improve our situation and the ways in which we live. And I guess we're still struggling. Oh, last question. Yeah. That would be so fascinating because you're right, because so much of our work is kind of psychometric. We're just asking people. I mean, in a small scale way, there are people who can engage with those kinds of triangulation of other methods. So bringing in physiological methods. I'm not aware of any kind of large scale cross-cultural attempts to do that, partly because at the moment the costs are quite prohibitive. But then again, the costs are coming down in terms of what it might take to get physiological measures. In an ideal world, if we had enough money, we would augment our kind of psychometric data collection with those types of metrics, because you would get some fascinating insights. But like I say, even if not on a cross-cultural scale or a kind of global scale, there's lots of great work. There's a whole paradigm called neurocorrelates of consciousness studies. So they're kind of measuring the brain states associated with different mental states, and some of the research there is fascinating, and dynamics of different meditative states and what their neurophysiological patterns are. To do that on a global scale would be amazing. And like I say, not within our remit at the moment, and perhaps not within anyone's remit in a kind of comprehensive way in which we've done with the psychometrics. But who knows in future, kind of the cost of these technologies coming down, and we could bring in those kind of paradigms as well. Anyway, it's a great question. Thank you. I think that's the last question, so I better wrap up now. I hope that's been interesting. Sorry, I think I was getting somewhat inarticulate towards the end. My tongue was feeling thick in my mouth. It's been a long day, but it's been really lovely to be here, and I hope it's been a good talk and just an interesting day generally. So thanks for having me, and nice to be here.